Like many, but not all ancient letters, Paul's letters contain closings that feature similar elements as those we saw Appian use in the closing of his letter in the last video. For example, in 1 Timothy, the final piece of the closing is a prayer, not a farewell prayer wish, but what we would call today a closing prayer or a benediction. It's found in the last half of verse 21, when Paul says, "Grace be with you." The interesting thing here is that the you is plural. It means all of you, which is one of the clues that shows Paul expected this letter to be read or heard by more than just Timothy. Another interesting thing is that this is the only feature of an ancient letter closing that is found in 1 Timothy. The closing in 1 Timothy in terms of letter features is very short, very abrupt. In some ways, we might have expected this, though, this short, succinct benedictory prayer wish. For although the opening includes expansions in terms of Paul's self-designation and the way he describes Timothy as my true child in the faith, but there's no transition at all in 1 Timothy, for Paul moves abruptly and quickly into the body of the letter with instructions and commands. Now, let's move on from looking at the benediction, which seems to be the only convention Paul uses in closing 1 Timothy that belongs to ancient letters. Let's think about the end of 1 Timothy in terms of its rhetorical conclusion. When we do, we'll discover there's a clear and important per oratio in 1 Timothy. Rhetorically, the per oratio functions in a speech, as we've already said, as a summary. And in the case of Paul's rhetoric, as a summary of the main points Paul wants those who listen to or read his letters to hear, to focus on, and to remember before he moves on to the actual letter closing itself. So the order is usually per oratio, the rhetorical closing first, and then the epistolary or letter closing last. In terms of the per oratio in 1 Timothy, the verses that seem to me to contain this kind of summary are verses 11 through 21 of the last chapter. And what we find there includes, first, a charge or command to Timothy concerning who he is called to be and what he is called to do as a man who belongs to God. We find this charge in verses 11 through 16. Secondly, there's a charge from Paul to Timothy to pass along to those at Ephesus who are rich in this world. And third, there is a command to Timothy to guard the truth and avoid godless chatter and what is falsely called knowledge. The thing to notice about this rhetorical summary is that it functions very effectively to summarize what Paul has said in terms of the main themes of 1 Timothy, and points us at the end of the letter back towards those major emphases in the letter as a whole. What Paul has talked in 1 Timothy to Timothy and to others who will hear this letter read, what he's talked about is first of all character that accords with righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. The fight of good faith is to hold on to these things, and in that way, to take hold of eternal life. He's also talked to Timothy in this letter about the balance between being in this world and its riches, and at the same time realizing that God's call is to be rich in good deeds and generosity. The third thing that his per oratio draws attention to is the need to guard the truth and avoid godless chatter, as Paul calls it, and what is falsely called knowledge, as he says. These are the two factors in my reading of 1 Timothy that form the context for understanding the text in 1 Timothy 2 and its instructions concerning women in worship, who were apparently, I believe, chattering godlessly in worship. And because of false knowledge, these women had derived from the culture in Ephesus They sought to dominate and exercise authority over men and husbands by claiming gifts of prophecy for themselves that were superior to those of any man. In these words, the summary of the two main messages of 1 Timothy in the peroration, and especially the closing of the peroration. The words that say, guard what has been entrusted to your care. The truths this letter has reminded Timothy of are those that he is he's supposed to guard. And second, Paul is encouraging, commanding, exhorting Timothy to turn away from godless chatter and to oppose ideas of what is falsely called knowledge, and how they affect the church at Ephesus, not only in respect to women, but in other respects as well. Now let's compare the closing of 1 Timothy to the closing of 2 Timothy, and then to the closing of Titus. In 2 Timothy, as I read and interpret the letter, the closing consists of a longer rhetorical peroratio than the one found in 1 Timothy. I would place its beginning in chapter 4 and verse 1, where we find the same kind of charge directed to Timothy personally that we found at the beginning of the peroratio in 1 Timothy. Like 1 Timothy, this one in 2 Timothy focuses on godly character and behavior and warns against turning away from truth and wandering into myths. The charge begins in chapter 4 and verse 1 and ends in 4 and verse 5 in these respects. After that, the charge continues in the peroratio with information. After that, we turn from the peroratio to information that Paul wants Timothy to know about his present condition. This is in chapter 4 in verses 6 through 8. Paul makes a request to Timothy to come to see him, and then conveys more information in chapter 4, 9 through 18. Paul makes a final request from Timothy to greet Prisca and Aquila, a closing greeting. Then there's some further information and the reiteration of Paul's request to Timothy to come and see him, and a longer two-part benediction in chapter 4 in verses 19 through 22. So this is a very complex conjunction, a compound of rhetorical features and epistolary features that we find at the end of 2 Timothy. In Titus, I take the conclusion to begin with the second half of verse 7 of the closing chapter, and the words, I desire you to insist on these things, are the pointer to it. The things Paul is talking about when he says, I desire you, Titus, to insist on these things, are the things Paul has talked about in the immediately preceding verses and the body of the letter as a whole. These things recommend good deeds and good character, and warn Titus to avoid controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels over the law. This is a different sort of warning in terms of what it warns against than the warning given in the letters to Timothy against godlessness and what is falsely called knowledge and myths. So we need to differentiate here, as elsewhere in Paul's letters, how the context and the location to which the letter is directed influence the kind of commands and exhortations that Paul uses, and the peroratio, which summarizes those things, where Paul writes his letters in order to help those who read them and hear them remember his main points. Paul does not write his letters to a universal church, but rather to specific churches in specific locations facing special kinds of situations. When Paul talks, for example, in Titus about quarrels over the law, he's obviously talking about the Jewish law, the Torah. But that's specific to Titus's situation, and that does not occur in 1 or 2 Timothy. And in the same way, when Paul talks in 1 and 2 Timothy about what is falsely called knowledge, This pertains to the context of 1st and 2nd Timothy and the location of Ephesus. Now that we've talked about the conclusions of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, in the next video, we'll talk about the conclusion of the letter to Philemon and how it too is written to a specific situation and a specific place or location. But for now, I want to leave you with a short quotation from an article written in the Bulletin for Biblical Research in 1995 by Dr. Jeffrey Wayma about the importance of analyzing Paul's letter closings and using what we find in them to read backwards as well as forwards as we read and interpret a Pauline letter and look for its major emphases. Here's the quotation by Dr. Wayma. The Pauline letter closings, he says, are carefully constructed units, shaped and adapted in such a way that they relate directly to, and in fact even summarize, the major concerns and themes taken up in the bodies of their respective letters. Consequently, the letter closings aid in important ways our understanding of Paul's purposes, arguments, and exhortations. Recently, my friend Dr. Scott McKnight noted that importance in a book he wrote, the importance of taking note of the conclusions. The book he wrote is entitled Reading Romans Backwards. In the book, Scott explains the way the closing of Romans helps to interpret the whole letter and why it was written. So in the module for this week, I've included a link to a video by Scott that you may or may not choose to learn more about Romans through the analysis of its conclusion. My hope for you in talking about the closings, the conclusions of Paul's letters, and in this week about the pastoral letters in Philemon, is that you too will see the interpretive importance of the closings. I hope you'll learn to read them carefully, think them through, reflect on what they're trying to say, and seek to understand how they fulfill the rhetorical function of a per oratio, as well as contain elements of an ancient letter closing. As you do that, you'll be using literary and rhetorical clues to see more of the meaning Paul hoped you would see in his letter closings, and using that meaning to interpret their main themes fruitfully.